The studio was buzzing with anticipation. Bright lights illuminated the sleek, modern set, where polished wood met cool-tone backdrops, the kind designed to give the illusion of journalistic credibility. The audience was seated in neat rows, some shifting in their chairs, others holding their phones at the ready, eager to capture what they hoped would be a defining moment. At the center of it all sat Julian Carter, the sharp-dressed, silver-tongued host who had built his career on dismantling guests who didn't share his worldview. He had interviewed Hollywood elites, political strategists, and corporate CEOs, always positioning himself as the intellectual superior, the arbiter of modern morality. But tonight was different. Tonight, he had the biggest guest of them all, President Donald J. Trump. Julian's smirk barely concealed his excitement. This was his moment, the opportunity to deliver a knockout, to corner Trump, to finally prove that his second-term victory was nothing more than a fluke. He had rehearsed his questions carefully, designed each one to chip away at the larger-than-life persona. He envisioned the headlines already. Trump stumbles in heated interview. Second-term president finally cornered on tough questions. He imagined the clips going viral, his face plastered across the news cycle as the man who had finally humbled Donald Trump. Then, Trump walked in. He moved with an ease that contradicted everything the media had spent years saying about him. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't defensive. If anything, he looked amused. Dressed in his signature suit, tie slightly looser than expected, he carried himself with the relaxed confidence of a man who had been through bigger battles than a studio debate. He had stepped into hostile territory before and he had won. Now he was back as the sitting president. The audience murmured, the energy shifting ever so slightly. Some were here to watch him fail, others to watch him dominate. But all of them knew one thing: this was going to be good. Julian stood, extending a hand. "Mr. President," he said, his voice smooth, controlled, the trained cadence of a media professional. Trump shook his hand firmly, giving the younger man a once-over before flashing that familiar half-smirk. "Julian," he said, "I hear you're very excited about this. Big moment for you. Big moment." A flicker of something crossed Julian's face, mild irritation, perhaps. The audience chuckled. Trump hadn't even sat down yet, and he was already setting the tone. They took their seats, cameras rolling. Julian adjusted his cuffs, leaning slightly forward, adopting that practiced look of serious inquiry. "Mr. President," he began, "you've built your entire persona on being tough, on being a fighter. But a lot of people feel that this outdated version of toughness, the idea that strength is about dominance rather than cooperation, is no longer relevant in today's world. Would you say your definition of strength is outdated?" Trump blinked, tilting his head slightly, as if genuinely puzzled by the question. "Outdated?" he repeated. "You mean like weak people telling everyone else that toughness doesn't matter?" A few people in the audience chuckled again. Julian ignored it, pressing on. "What I mean is, in today's society, we're moving toward a more inclusive idea of leadership, one that values empathy over brute force." Trump exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You know, this is the kind of thing only people who never had to be tough say. You ever see a firefighter run into a burning building? A soldier on the battlefield? A mother working 2 jobs just to keep food on the table? You think those people sit around talking about new definitions of strength? No, they don't. They know what it takes. Real strength isn't about making up fancy words. It's about getting the job done." Julian's jaw tightened. He had expected Trump to bluster, to get defensive. Instead, he was cutting straight through the nonsense. Julian shifted gears. "But don't you think there's a problem when toughness is used as an excuse for toxic behavior? A lot of people argue that your approach, your rhetoric, your leadership style has been divisive rather than unifying." Trump leaned back in his chair, completely at ease. "You mean people who didn't like me? People who spent years screaming about how terrible I am, and now they want to talk about unity?" He let out a sharp laugh. "That's rich. Let me tell you something. Unity isn't about pretending to agree with nonsense. It's about standing for what's right, even when it's not popular. The audience reacted again, some nodding, others exchanging glances. Julian's expression remained neutral, but there was a slight edge in his voice now. So, you don't believe that leaders should be more careful with their words? That accountability is important. Trump shrugged. Look, accountability is great. But you and I both know that's not what you mean. You mean cancel culture. You mean people losing their jobs because they said something 10 years ago. You mean fake outrage mobs trying to shut people up. And let's be honest, Julian, you love cancel culture, don't you? Julian's lips parted slightly. He wasn't used to being put on the spot. I wouldn't say that, he replied smoothly. Trump raised an eyebrow. No? Then how come every time someone says something you don't like, you guys act like it's the end of the world? I say something, and suddenly it's dangerous. Someone else says the exact same thing, but they're on your side, and it's brave. You don't care about accountability. You care about control. The audience let out a low murmur. Julian shifted in his seat, but he forced a smile. That's an interesting perspective, but let's talk about something else. Trump smirked. Yeah, let's. The energy in the room had changed. Julian had come in expecting to steer the conversation, but Trump was already running circles around him. The host had spent years perfecting the art of setting traps, guiding guests into saying something that could be spun against them. But Trump wasn't walking into any traps. He was bulldozing through them. And Julian knew it. The interview was just getting started. Julian adjusted the stack of cue cards on his lap, buying himself a second to recalibrate. The audience had laughed more than he expected, and Trump hadn't taken the bait. No matter. He had plenty of ammunition. Mr. President, he said, regaining his polished tone, let's be honest. This idea of toughness that you promote, the old school never back down mentality, isn't that a little outdated? The world is changing. People are embracing different kinds of leadership, cooperation, diplomacy, empathy. The idea that strength only comes from being dominant. Well, isn't it time to move past that? Trump leaned back slightly, lips pursed like he was about to let Julian in on a secret. So, you're saying toughness is outdated? He nodded, pretending to consider it. You know, every time I hear people say things like this, I always think the same thing. You guys live in a world where nothing bad ever happens to you, don't you? You sit in nice studios, fancy buildings, air conditioning, very comfortable chairs. Very nice, by the way. Expensive. Good taste. He gestured around the set. The audience chuckled, and Julian forced a polite smile, waiting for the point. But out there, Trump continued, his tone sharpening. In the real world, it's not all nice studios and comfortable chairs. You know what happens in the real world? People fight. They compete. Bad guys don't sit around talking about feelings. Strong countries don't survive by being nice. And when things get tough, because they always do, nobody's looking around for the most cooperative person in the room. They're looking for the guy who can handle it. Julian's smile was tight, his fingers pressing slightly into the cue cards. So, you're saying we don't need cooperation? That diplomacy isn't important? Trump scoffed. I didn't say that. You see, this is what you guys do. You take something obvious, like toughness being important, and then twist it into something ridiculous. Oh, so you don't believe in cooperation? That's like saying if I like steak, I must hate chicken. Very silly. Let me tell you, I did more deals than anyone. I got things done that these so-called diplomatic leaders couldn't even dream of. You know why? Because they were weak. And weakness never wins. Not in business, not in life, not in leadership. The audience clapped, louder this time. Julian shifted in his chair, glancing toward the producers just off camera. But Julian pushed forward, keeping his voice smooth. Wouldn't you say that in today's society, people want leaders who show empathy? People want to be heard, not just dictated to. Trump raised his eyebrows. You know, I love when people like you talk about what people want. You ever talk to people, Julian? Regular people? Because I do. Everywhere I go. You know what they tell me? They want someone who gets things done. They don't want a guy who stands up there giving long, emotional speeches about how hard everything is. They want someone who fixes things. Julian opened his mouth, but Trump wasn't done. Let me ask you something, Trump continued, sitting forward now, locking eyes with the host. If something bad happens, God forbid, say a guy breaks into your house tonight, are you calling some empathetic leader to come hold your hand? Or do you want the biggest, toughest, meanest guy you can find to come handle it? A few gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by a burst of laughter and scattered applause. Julian's jaw tightened. That's not the same. No, it's exactly the same, Trump cut in. Toughness isn't about being mean. It's about being prepared. It's about handling business. Weakness doesn't save you. Toughness does. Julian licked his lips, sitting back, switching gears. All right, Mr. President, but don't you think part of the problem is that toughness is often mistaken for aggression? That your approach, your rhetoric, your leadership has been seen as reckless? Trump smirked. By who? Julian blinked. By the media? Your friends? The same people who spent years screaming that I was literally the worst person to ever live. He laughed, shaking his head. Give me a break. Julian took a breath. Mr. President, I'm talking about... No, I get it, Trump interrupted. You want to talk about accountability? Let's talk about it. Let's talk about how every time someone on your side screws up, there's always an excuse. Always a reason. But if I say one wrong word, suddenly it's a crisis. That's not accountability. That's control. More applause. Julian pressed his lips together, hands tightening over the cue cards. He had expected Trump to be aggressive. He had expected him to dodge, to bluster, to make vague, empty statements. Instead, he was turning every question into an attack. And worse, he was making it entertaining. Julian forced a chuckle, shaking his head like he was dealing with a stubborn child. All right, Mr. President, I hear you, but let's talk about cancel culture. Some people argue that it's just about consequences. That if you say something harmful, there should be accountability. What's so bad about that? Trump tilted his head. What's bad about it? Julian nodded. Yes. Don't actions have consequences? Trump laughed. Oh, they do now? Because for years, when people on my side got banned, censored, demonetized, where was all this talk about consequences then? You guys weren't talking about fairness. You were talking about control. You wanted to shut people up, plain and simple. Julian opened his mouth, but Trump was rolling now. You know what's funny? You guys love to talk about harmful speech. But let me ask you something, Julian. You ever notice how all the harmful speech just so happens to be speech you don't like? I say something you don't agree with. It's dangerous. Someone else says the exact same thing, but they're on your side? Oh, now it's brave. Now it's speaking truth to power. The audience clapped again, and this time it was stronger, lasting longer. Julian could feel the energy shifting, slipping out of his control. Let's be real, Julian. You don't care about harmful speech. You care about making sure the wrong people can't talk. Julian's fingers curled slightly around the armrest. He was losing the room. He could feel it. Trump leaned back, tapping the desk lightly. Come on, Julian. Next question. Make it a good one. The audience laughed. Julian forced a smile. He had lost control, but he wasn't giving up yet. Julian inhaled slowly, regaining his composure. He had let Trump dictate the pace, but it wasn't over. He had a plan. He glanced down at his notes, tapping a carefully highlighted section before looking back up with renewed confidence. Mr. President, you've spent years attacking the media, calling us the enemy of the people. But let's be honest, without the press, democracy doesn't function. You wouldn't even be sitting here today without the very media you claim is corrupt. So, my question is, if the media is as bad as you say, why do you keep using it when it benefits you? Trump exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. You see what he did there, folks? Very sneaky. Very tricky. But not tricky enough. He turned to the audience, gesturing toward Julian. This is what they do. He's not sitting here saying, no, we're very fair. We tell the truth. He's not saying that because he can't. He knows they lie. He knows they spin. He just wants to know why I'm still standing after years of fake stories. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Julian's fingers tightened slightly over his cue cards, but he pressed forward. The media's job is to hold leaders accountable, Julian said. If that means criticizing you, that's not corruption. That's reporting. Trump tilted his head. Is that right? So let me ask you who holds you accountable. Because I'll tell you who it should be. It should be the American people. But you don't care about them, do you? You don't report on what matters to them. You don't care about what's happening in their towns, their jobs, their families. No, you care about stories. You care about headlines. You care about pushing an agenda. And when the truth doesn't fit, you twist it. Julian opened his mouth, but Trump kept going. I've seen how you operate. When things are going well for the country, you ignore it. When businesses grow, when families do better, when communities succeed, nothing. But the second something goes wrong, boom. Breaking news. Emergency reports. But it's not because you care. It's because you need a crisis. You live on division. You don't tell the people what's happening. You tell them what to think. The audience murmured. Julian could feel the shift happening again. Mr. President, let's talk about accountability. Trump laughed. Now, you want to talk about accountability? Where was all this talk about accountability when the media was wrong? When big tech was censoring stories? Let me tell you, Julian, the media's not about accountability. It's about power. And you guys lost control. That's why you hate me so much. Because I don't play by your rules. Julian blinked, struggling to keep his expression neutral. He knew this moment was being clipped in real time, shared across social media before the interview was even finished. Mr. President, since you brought up big tech. Oh, I love this one, Trump interrupted, smirking. Go ahead, let's talk about big tech. Julian straightened his posture. Many argue that platforms have a responsibility to prevent misinformation, fact-checking, removing dangerous content. These aren't about censorship. They're about public safety. Trump's smirk widened. Public safety? You mean controlling speech. You mean making sure only one side gets heard. Julian sighed. No, I mean preventing harm. Trump leaned forward. Tell me something, Julian. Who decides what's harmful? You? Your friends at these platforms? Because funny enough, every time something gets fact-checked, it's always against people like me. You ever notice that? If I say something, it's misinformation. If someone on your side says it, suddenly, it's important dialogue. Julian swallowed. That's not. Oh, it is, Trump cut in. And it's not just about me. It's about the American people. When a mom questions what her kid is being taught, when a worker talks about why their paycheck doesn't go as far, when a small business owner says, hey, these regulations are killing me, what happens? They get shut down, labeled, flagged, suspended. You don't just silence me, you silence them. And that's the real problem. A few people in the audience clapped, some nodding. Julian shifted in his seat. Mr. President, no one is saying... Oh, you're saying plenty, Trump interrupted again. Just not the truth. Julian exhaled, reaching for his next question. Let's talk about something that really matters. Crime. You've been extremely critical of progressive policies, claiming they've made things worse. But statistics show crime is a complex issue. Trump scoffed. Oh, statistics show. Here we go. Let me ask you something, Julian. Have you been to these cities? Have you walked down these streets? Or do you just read about it in some study written by a guy who also never leaves his office? Julian forced a smile. Mr. President, crime is down in many areas. Trump waved a hand. Crime is down? Where? You walk into a store, people are looting. No consequences. You park your car in the wrong place. It gets broken into. You go to a gas station, and they tell you not to wear nice watches because it's too dangerous. And you sit here talking about statistics like people don't see what's happening with their own eyes? Julian opened his mouth, but Trump wasn't finished. You know why crime is out of control? Because weak leaders let it happen. Because they care more about protecting criminals than protecting citizens. But this isn't about me. It's about every hardworking person out there who just wants to live in a safe neighborhood, who wants to open their business without worrying about getting robbed, who wants their kids to grow up in a country where the law still means something. They deserve that. They deserve better than this mess. The audience clapped again. Julian could hear the shift, feel the weight of it pressing down. He tried again. You're saying reform efforts. I'm saying your policies made things worse. Trump shot back. You want to be soft on crime? Fine. But don't be surprised when people stop feeling safe. Don't be surprised when stores shut down. Don't be surprised when good people leave. Because guess what? That's what's happening. Julian forced a tight smile, moving quickly. Mr. President, let's... Trump held up a hand. You know what I love? When people like you talk about crime being complex. Like it's some mystery. Like nobody knows why it's happening. Here's why it's happening. Weak leadership. Weak policies. Weak enforcement. That's it. Very simple. But here's the good news. We're fixing it. We're bringing back safety. We're bringing back order. And we're doing it for the American people. Not for politicians. Not for special interests. Not for whatever the latest trend is. We're doing it for them. More applause. Julian's throat tightened. Even some of the neutral audience members were nodding now. The moment had slipped from him completely. Trump leaned back, tapping his fingers against the desk. Come on, Julian. Next question. Make it a good one. The audience laughed. Julian's forced smile remained, but his grip on the conversation was gone. Julian's grip on his cue cards tightened. He needed to shift the conversation fast. Mr. President, let's talk about real leadership. Strength isn't just about power. It's about control, about knowing when to show restraint. Many say your approach is reckless, that your tough stance on crime, immigration, and foreign policy creates more problems than it solves. Trump smirked. You mean the problems that already exist? Crime? That's not me. That's weak leadership. Open borders? That's not toughness. That's stupidity. And foreign policy? Let me tell you something, Julian. When I was in office the first time, nobody was starting wars. Russia? Behaved. China? Behaved. Iran? Behaved. You know why? Because they knew I wasn't playing games. I wasn't writing strongly worded letters or asking for meetings. I was saying, you mess around and you find out. That's leadership. The crowd clapped. Julian ignored it, pressing forward. But Mr. President, toughness alone doesn't solve everything. Don't you think? Trump leaned in. Toughness solves everything. Name one problem this country has that got better because leaders were weak. You can't. Crime? Weak DAs, weak mayors, weak judges, letting criminals walk free. The border? Weak policies. Inflation? Weak decisions from people too afraid to stand up to bad ideas. Weakness ruins nations, Julian. Strength builds them. Julian swallowed. He could feel the audience shifting further against him. Even so, many believe your rhetoric is dangerous, that it emboldens the wrong kind of people. Trump laughed. Wrong kind of people? You mean the American worker? The parents who don't want their kids indoctrinated? The cops who get spat on for doing their jobs? The people who just want common sense back? Those people? Because if that's who's emboldened by me, good. They deserve a leader who fights for them. The audience erupted. Julian sat frozen, realizing that no matter how he tried to spin it, he had lost them. He cleared his throat. Mr. President. Trump held up a hand. No, Julian, let me ask you something. Say your house is on fire. You want a firefighter who's tough, or one who's worried about being too aggressive with the hose. Say your family's in danger. You want a cop who's strong, or one who's asking the criminal how he feels. Strength isn't dangerous. Weakness is. And the people trying to make this country weak? They're the real threat. Julian had nothing. Silence hung in the air before the audience exploded in applause. Trump leaned back, satisfied. Come on, Julian. Give me a real question. But Julian wasn't asking the questions anymore. The room belonged to Trump now. The second the interview ended, Julian barely managed to keep his professional smile intact as the cameras cut. Trump stood, adjusting his cufflinks with the ease of a man who had just wrapped up another victory. He gave the audience a casual wave before turning to Julian with a smirk. "Tough interview, huh?" he said, patting him on the shoulder. The audience laughed, some clapping again as Trump strolled off the set, completely unbothered. Backstage, the producers were in chaos. Assistants scrambled, earpieces buzzed, and Julian yanked off his mic with a clenched jaw. The damage was done. He knew it. The network knew it. Before they could even think about how to edit the footage for damage control, raw clips were already flooding social media. Boom. Within minutes, the internet exploded. Clips of Trump's takedowns spread like wildfire. Memes popped up instantly. One clip of Trump leaning in with "Strength isn't dangerous. Weakness is" had already been edited with dramatic music, slow-motion replays, and bold captions. It trended worldwide within the hour. Trump obliterates smug host. Julian Carter gets wrecked on live TV. Weakness ruins nations, and Julian just proved it. Even mainstream media outlets, who normally ignored Trump's viral moments, had no choice but to cover it. But they were scrambling. Desperate headlines appeared. Trump's dangerous words stoke division again. Experts say Trump's tough guy act is harmful to democracy. Fact check, is weakness really the problem? But it didn't matter. The people weren't buying it. In the comments, the narrative had already shifted. Even skeptics admitted Julian got demolished. Others rewatched old Trump speeches, realizing his message had been consistent all along. The meltdown from left-wing pundits only made it worse. They tried to spin it, tried to dismiss it, but they knew the truth. Trump hadn't just won the interview. He had won the moment. The kind of moment that reminded everyone why he was back in the White House, why people still lined up for his rallies, why they tuned in whenever he spoke. And Trump? He said nothing. No tweets. No press statements. No gloating. He didn't need to. He had already won. Julian Carter slumped in his chair, staring blankly at the desk, while his producers argued in his earpiece. Meanwhile, outside the studio, Trump walked through the exit doors, adjusting his tie, flashing a thumbs up to a roaring crowd waiting outside. He climbed into his black SUV, the door shut behind him, and just like that he was gone. But the moment? That would live forever. If this story touched you, click on more heartwarming stories that are showing on your screen. For more stories celebrating real human values, please subscribe to American Stories.